So we're going to do a little quick recap and then just sort of start moving forward. Okay, so the last time we talked about how auto scaling worked and how pools in general work and sort of the process of spinning up a new account, right? Does anybody here have any questions about that? So we went through sort of adding an account, going through steps 1 through 4, and then once that was done, you got this interface where we went and created an image. And I think that image is still there. It's called tag demo image. And then we created a new host pool. And we went through sort of the auto scaling settings. Does anybody have any questions about any of that?
Just a quick comment, Tony.
Yep. Hey, Keith. Yep.
So when when we do our estimating, our cost estimating, does that come across in some sort of form that when the guys actually now fill out this setup, that they're using the exact same type of servers that we kind of estimated in the beginning? I mean, because obviously it looks like you can choose whatever you want as you're the installer.
Right.
At the same time, we want to match what it is that the estimate was on the sales side, right? So is there a a form that comes across once you choose this from the configurator, if you will? Here's what the guys should really be setting up.
Yeah, so that's a great question, and I'm glad you asked that, because that's actually somewhere that's something that people make mistakes on all the time, right? Because typically the person doing the quoting might be somebody like you, and then the person doing the project is not you, right? And so when you do the quote, out the other end comes a PDF document that looks like this, which is basically a printout of the quote. And what we do at Nerdio is we give that printout to our engineers, but your guys should also have it as well, right? And what we tell people is, say, hey, if you want this price, the price that we're suggesting, you have to actually pick VMs that match the size. Otherwise, your pricing is going to be way off, because here you are quoting one thing, but then the person implementing it is doing something completely different. But there is no way, there's no like systematic way to do it. It's all by making sure you're picking the right sizes based on the quote.
And that's fine. Okay.
Yeah. So and I'll agree with you, it's tricky, because like this SKU right here, D2 ASV4, there's a D2 AV4, there's a D2 ASV3, there's a D2 4V2. It looks similar enough where if you're not paying attention, you can very easily confuse yourself. And people make those mistakes all the time, even on the distributor side. When you tell them to reserve instance something, they may reserve a machine that looks very similar to that, but not exactly that machine. And if they did that, then you're not getting the discount. So unfortunately, it's not as simple as you might think it is or hope it was, but it's the world we live in, where you have to be responsible for cross-checking what somebody else might be doing to make sure that the price you're getting is the price you want, but also cross-checking the decisions that the distributor's making, because oftentimes they make mistakes as well. Okay, so that's like a warning, because I see it all the time. Right, you'll go to a distributor and say, hey, I want to reserve 2 of these machines, and then they'll reserve something very similar to it, but not exactly the same type. And then you'll discover a couple of months later, why did my price not go down? Why am I actually paying more than what I thought? And then they'll pull me into the call, and then we'll look at it together, and we'll cross-reference it together, and we'll find the mistake. And then the distributor provides the credit. But obviously, we don't want any of that stuff to happen. So good thing you pointed it out, but that point is very important. Making sure that the sizes match up what you're actually intending to deploy. Great question. Anything along those same lines? I actually have another webinar that I do that talks about frequently asked questions from MSPs on the sales operation side, and then also frequently asked questions on the technical side. I can talk to Lane about showing you how to attend one of those webinars as well. So those are great for, once you've made a decision to use Nerdio, once you've deployed something, how do you make sure the rest of your team is aligned from a process standpoint, so you don't make these mistakes, right? So that's something that's also very common is, on an on-prem environment, if you're running a Hyper-V or ESXi host, when you buy a piece of server, you're going to buy more than what you truly need today. So if somebody calls in and says, hey, my server's running slow, it's very typical that somebody on the help desk is just going to go to vSphere and go increase and give it double the amount of memory or give it double the amount of CPU, right? But if that person does the same thing in Azure, now your reserve instances and what you've actually deployed is misaligned, and you're not getting the cost savings. So there's a lot of standard procedures that need to be in place when you're dealing with Azure that doesn't necessarily need to be there when you're dealing with an on-prem server. And of course, if you've been burned by having done one of those things, you'll never get burnt again because you'll probably implement those practices. But if you've never done it before, those are the warnings that I'm giving you today because it happens all the time. All right, when you get burnt, yeah, you're going to pay a couple $100 more that month, but you'll probably learn from that mistake as well. Okay. So we went through sort of setting up the environment. Let's go through that again. So we set up the golden image first, right? We pick one from the Azure library. When we're ready to update the image, you simply just turn it on. And then once we get in, we RDP into this IP address, make the changes we want. And then when we're done, we click the button that says power off inside this image. Nerdio will sysprep the machine and make it all ready, right? So if you're kind of curious what the power off inside this image button does, the last time I clicked it was 2 days ago. If I go to the details, you'll see that Nerdio's automation pretty much did every single step that you would have to do manually if you didn't have a tool helping you do this. All right, we're gonna start the sysprep, make sure everything is all done properly. Sysprep, seal, generalize the image, and make the image ready to deploy. And Curtis on the call, I'm going to use his example again, but we did this process this morning where Curtis turned on a machine, already pinned into it, did some Windows updates, installed some new applications. And I don't know if you've done this already, but when you're done, you click on power off and set this image, and it goes through the process of sealing the template. So then, if you have the auto scaling engine already configured, and you have the resize of your image already configured, it'll automatically replace the machine. But if not, you can pretty much make it update from the host. So I think today's topic is about troubleshooting WVD. Let me just make sure it's troubleshooting ongoing support and maintenance of WVD environment. Right. So from a troubleshooting standpoint, we'll spend some time on that. The number one issue with WVD environment is that somebody complains that it's running slow. That's probably like 99% of like the type of tickets we get is somebody saying it's running slow, right? And that could be caused by a couple of things, right? Some of the most common things that causes this is disk IOPS. So it's not what you think. It's not CPU. It's maybe not memory, but it's more disk IOPS. So whenever you're deploying, can somebody tell me, I guess, how FSLogix works? Because that understanding that will help you troubleshoot a lot of things. Anybody here? Jonathan, how about you? You know this.
Sure, yeah. Now, FSLogix, basically a dynamic disk image that's designed specifically for the profile. So rather than your traditional roaming profiles that pulls from, slower file services, it's more of a dynamic, almost RAM kind of access to the profile that follows your login around to whatever session host you jump into.
Yeah. So
is that different than a user profile disk, or is that the same concept?
It's the same concept. So Microsoft tried to copy what FSLogix did prior to its acquisition in 2018. So prior to 2018, prior to them just buying FSLogix outright, they tried to do what FSLogix did really well, which is created their own thing called UPDs, which is a image file that's stored in some kind of centralized storage location. And that storage location could be a file server, it could be in Azure Files. Those are sort of the two more common ones. But basically, every time somebody logs into their Windows 10 box, that profile attaches under the hood to that Windows 10 machine, right, that you're logging into. And unbeknownst to the machine itself, the Windows machine doesn't even know that that thing is being connected to from outside of its own box. If you go to the C drive, go to the user folder, go to the person, you'll see that profile looks like it's normally there, just like it would in a physical machine. So FSLogix kind of tricks the Windows 10 operating system to think everybody's profile is local to the machine, even though the process of attaching and unattaching happens during the user's log on and log off, which is great because that allows us to make these Windows 10 machines very portable and disposable. So remember the other day I kept talking about, you can make it so every single morning somebody comes into a brand new computer, how many less issues you would have if that were the case. That's all thanks to FSLogix, right? So user profile, users customizations, desktop documents, desktop, OneDrive cache, Outlook cache, all that lives in that VHDX file. So that attaches when somebody logs in, that deattaches and returns back to a storage location when somebody logs off. So that thing right there, that profile could be somewhere between 15 to 30 gigs is sort of the standard range. Sometimes it could be more, 50 gigs. Sometimes I've seen, but that profile is being attached and deattached upon login and log off. So during the times of log in, so basically 8 in the morning when people start logging into their computers for work, you're pulling that profile, the entirety of that profile, from some kind of centralized storage location. And when you pull that profile, imagine like 10 other people logging on at the same exact time. Your disk that those profiles are stored on can't keep up with how much data you're pulling from it. So what it actually develops is a disk queue, right? So I'll give you some examples. And this is like if you're running across a performance issue, this is probably the number one thing I would probably look for to troubleshoot whether that is the issue or not. So what you do here is go to portal.azure.com. and you would log into your customer's environment. I have a test one here, so I'm going to pick one to log into. And you guys can follow along if you have a Nerdio deployment, which is good. So Curtis, if you want to follow along with Masters, that'll give you a good idea of maybe there are experiencing some performance issue, but maybe just not saying it. Okay, so let me factor myself. Okay, so once you get to your Azure portal, if you're using a file server to store your FSLogix profiles, the easiest way to check to see if performance is an issue is going to the file server itself and going down on the left side to the metrics tab. So metrics is going to show you a line chart of how throttled the disk was over the last 30 days. So if I get here, I'm going to go down to the disk queue depth preview chart. And then I want to look at disk usage at its max, not the average. And I also want to look at performance over the last 30 days. Now, you can see here, when I was setting up this environment back in March 5th, I was probably doing a lot of profile moving around and logging and testing. And you can see that the disk queue spiked up above 5, right? And then it went all the way up to about 17 or so. Right, and I was probably doing something here and there, but for the most part, this customer was under 5, right? So disk queue basically means, if I'm requesting so much data from the disk and my disk can't keep up, it develops a queue, right? So you have to wait for the data to come across. When you're waiting for your profile to pretty much attach yourself to the session host, that can come across as just being stuck on the login screen, right? Loading FSLogix profile, or just things being generally sluggish, right? So if that file server is also used for other things like map drives and maybe application data, and you're hitting that, with other processes other than just FSLogix, you might see this chart kind of go all over the place. But your goal here is to try to keep your disk queues under 5. Now you see little spikes like this, that's okay, but just make sure they're not consistently up there. When we see disk queues consistently above 5, even if a customer isn't complaining, I'll probably reach out to the MSP and say, hey, go and check to see if the customer's complaining or not, because from the basis of what I'm looking at, they should be having a pretty horrible user experience, right? And for those who do complain and they come back to us and say, hey, customer's complaining, we typically see this, like on average, probably like 10 or even up to 35 or even 70 sometimes. And when that happens, you need to fix that, right? Because you need to fix the bottleneck. Now, how do you fix that? Well, there's more things you have to understand to troubleshoot this. And I think I've talked about this previously, but I'll mention it again. But IOPS is probably the most important thing when it comes to Azure. I think even when Rick Harbor opened up this webinar, he mentioned that as well. IOPS is absolutely the most important thing. So when you don't have enough IOPS, you're going to develop a disk queue because your disk isn't spinning fast enough to give you the data you need in time. So if you look at this chart, and I'll paste this chart in the chat here, it's a good chart to always have bookmarked and reference all the time because, well, at least I do it. How do I get to? Can't see my chat window anymore. I'll figure out how to send it to you guys later. But oh, here it is. It's hiding. Okay, so this is a really good chart to kind of have bookmarked because it's a good reference, right? So these are disk sizes that you assign to your file server or really any server or any machine, right? So if you think about what a managed disk is, and there's different types of managed disks. This is a premium managed disk. A managed disk is just a piece of carved out SAN inside of an Azure region or data center. Right, so think about a Azure data center. You have one side of the data center that has all your D series machines. Maybe you have a different side of the data center that has all your E series machines. And then maybe on the opposite side of the data center, you have racks and racks of premium storage that, when you go and order a piece of a 256 gig premium storage, to give you a carved out section of that, right? And what happens is your VM is running here, your disk is running on the opposite side of the data center, and what happens is when you attach a C drive to a VM, that operating system is loaded onto that piece of SAN that gets connected to the VM via iSCSI, right? That's just like a software-defined SAN is basically what's happening in the background. But when it's presented to you, you just see a VM with a C drive, right? But that drive, whatever you choose to carve out, the size of the drive has everything to do with performance. So if you carve out a 128 gig managed disk, you're only getting a maximum of 500 IOPS and 100 megabytes throughput per second, right? With bursting capability of 3,500 IOPS. And as you go larger, you get more IOPS that Microsoft gives you. So if you pick a VM size that is too small, or you pick a disk size that's too small, and you need more IOPS, you need to grow in size, right? So sometimes you'll see like somebody provisioning a 1 terabyte machine when really they're only using about 300 gigs because they're doing something on that requires the 5,000 IOPS that 2,300 won't let them do, right? So that's number one, is making sure your disk is fast enough to accommodate what you're trying to do. Okay, so typically when I see this disk queue really, really high, I'll tell them to upgrade the disk, right? But at the same time, disk isn't the only factor in speed. Right? There's another chart I want you guys to have, and I'll send you this one as well. You should also bookmark this. But this, and a lot of people don't know this, which is why like people get stuck or mess up all the time. But a lot of people will attach a really, really large disk to a machine that is typically too small, right? So let's say you attach a 4 terabyte disk to a D2 SV3 machine, right? So we look at this chart, we have a 4 terabyte disk. That 4 terabyte disk can run up to 7,500 IOPS and up to 250 megs per second. And you take that disk and you assign it to a, let's say, file server that's a 2-core 8 gig of RAM file server, right? Now, on premise, I know you could do that all the time, and there's no issues with that, right? But this is not on premise, right? In Azure, if you look at this chart, it says the max uncached IOPS and throughput megs per second for this machine, right? Max burst and max regular IOPS. You can see that the machine can only fully take advantage of 3,200 IOPS and only 48 megs per second, max, right? Across all its drives. So if you assign a C drive, which already takes up some IOPS, and then you assign a D drive or an E drive that has the 4 terabytes of data that can go up to 7,500 and 250 megs per second, and your max, IOPS and disk that machine can even handle is only 3,248. Well, you're severely bottlenecked by having a machine that's too low, right? So that's something that gets people all the time. And of course, when you're quoting something out with me, I'll already know this rule, and I'll make sure that you don't fall into that. But if you're sort of doing this on your own, you may not know that, and people come to us with help desk tickets all the time, and we see this all the time where you have a really large disk and you're assigned a VM really, really small to it, and that's a bottleneck right here. So what do you have to do? You have to actually pick a VM that has IOPS and throughput that exceeds the totality of all your disks that are assigned to it, which could be bad, right? Because maybe you're not really running anything on this file server. You just need it for the speed, but yet I have to go and give it a really large VM size to be able to fully take advantage of the VM, right? So that's why Azure Files might be a better solution, because Azure Files gives you IOPS completely differently than how a managed disk attaches to a VM. So FSLogix can live in a VM-based file server, or it can live in Azure Files, and it basically can live in anywhere that has an SMB share. It's just those two are the most common locations for it. If you own a NetApp SAN inside of Azure, if you own a what do they call those? The SUNY filer, you can use any of those to store your FSLogix profiles. But the thing you have to pay attention to is IOPS. So if you're actually needing a 4 terabyte disk that's 7,500 IOPS and 250 megs per second, you have to actually look at different VM series, because different VM series have different uh, basically IOPS limitations based on the size, right? So if you look at a DSV3 series, you notice that a 2-core 8 gig of RAM will limit you in just 3,200 IOPS and 48 megs per second, a 2-core 8 gig of RAM machine. But if you go to the DSV2 family, a 2-core 7 gig machine has double the IOPS and throughput, right? So that's very interesting. So why is that? I don't want to go too deep into it, but it's got something to do with the fact that DS2 families have real processors versus vCPUs, so they must be assigning that based on compute somehow. But if you had a 4 terabyte drive, the cheapest VM to get that'll give you exceed the throughput capacity that you're looking for is probably a DS3 V2. The DS3 V2 is a 4-core 14 gig of RAM machine, but you can see that its IOPS is way higher than 7,500, right? So if you pair a 4 terabyte disk with that, then you're not gonna hit your IOP limit. Any questions about that? I know that was kind of weird to jump into, but it's the number one issue we see all the time. And I showed you guys the other day how FSLogix calculate. I mean, how Azure Files calculates its IOPS. It's completely different, and it's got nothing to do with what VM or what size disk you attach to a VM.
So when you guys go in and sell these types of things, do you have clauses, or do you just make an expectation of, hey, we're going to try this for now, see how IOPS roll, and then increase based on performance? Or, I mean, I just think I'm going to struggle trying to find that proper IOPS, on the fly or ahead of time.
Yeah, there's formulas you could use, like for FSLogix, they say a concurrent login is going to use about 50 IOPS, but that's Microsoft's recommendations, and that's only if that's the only thing running in that file system, right? So if you're using a file server, you're likely using that file server to also host your QuickBooks and your map drives, and so keep in mind those things also eat up some IOPS that are not, you're not, those IOPS aren't dedicated to FSLogix, but FSLogix is where you see it the most, right? So that's why, now we're sort of saying, if you're going to use a combination of map drives and need to store FSLogix profiles, take your FSLogix profiles, throw it in Azure Files, have that completely separate from what you're doing with the file server and map drives. That way you have, if you run into a IOPS issue with map drives, you're not going to really be able to tell or see the difference, but you're going to be able to feel it if your FSLogix is bottlenecked. So we're doing this thing now where we're kind of segregating the FSLogix, putting it on disks that have nothing to do with anything else you're doing in the environment. But if you do this quote with us, we'll make sure that none of this stuff happens. I'm just kind of showing you guys what can commonly happen if you're not careful. Right.
What it sounds like, Tony, is you've got the experience that you've dealt with this enough times that you've got a pretty good idea of how many IOPS company X versus company Y versus company A versus company F is going to need based on number of users. Does that sound about right?
Yes, but also applications is also important. So I talked to a customer that's only 13 users, right? He had like a 4 terabyte hard drive, and his VM was sized properly with the amount of IOPS that the disk gave them. But that MSP put 4 different sync tools with inside the image, right? They had Dropbox, they had Google Sync, they had Box.com, and they had OneDrive, all syncing different things. And that process of they all call it different things, but like OneDrive calls it limited sync, or I forget what it is called, but different tools have different things where it can analyze what you're using and what to keep locally and what to tier up to the cloud. That process of trying to figure that out across just one of those sync tools can cause a massive IOPS disruption. But that customer had four different tools.
That
Right.
wasn't very smart on their part.
Yeah, right. But again, they didn't know, so
Yeah,
because
but
maybe on
still.
a normal computer that would have been fine. Maybe not even. But I mean that one was a very specific use case. There was a restaurant chain that had different brands under the restaurant. Each restaurant used a different sync tool. But what they should have done was probably split out them into different images and not put them all in one image. So
Yeah, I would.
very
That
taxing.
would have been my suggestion from the get go on that one.
Yeah. So it is, unfortunately an experience thing, and you don't really know till you've seen it. And I probably don't know all the use cases or all the things that can shoot, people do that can shoot themselves in the foot. But I could only show you what I know, right? What I've seen, and we've definitely seen a lot here in Nerdio. We get thousands and thousands of deployments. So we want to say we've seen it all, but that's we're here to help you make those decisions so you don't shoot yourself in the foot by making a bad decision. Right.
Sounds good.
Yeah. And again, I came from the MSP world. The MSP I came from are only today starting to work with us and doing this because they were always so afraid of VDI, right? Their prior experience with VDI was winning a customer because some other MSP screwed up with VDI, and so that was the only way that they could. They came in and said, "Hey, we'll take you back on premise because VDIs don't work," right? And a lot of MSPs who actually try VDI fail, and so they never touch it again, right? And it's because we haven't had the experience with it. But enterprise organizations have been doing this for many years, and those guys really know what they're doing, but they do it focused on the company they work in. So we're just trying to take the knowledge, and that space is called EUC. If you're ever interested in digging deeper into this space, it's called end user computing. It's like a whole different category of IT. It's basically a heavy focus on VDIs and thin clients and delivering IT solutions in that manner. But we're trying to take that knowledge and that experience and bring it down to the SMB level. And it starts with just doing webinars like this. All right. So any questions about IOPS and performance and how it affects performance? So the number two thing we see is, again, that hits performance is not CPU, because we always think support performance is a CPU thing, and that's probably like the last thing that affects your end user experience. The second thing is, believe it or not, memory, right? So whenever we quote, now who remembers this, right? What is the ideal VM family to use for a session host? What series? D, F, E, B, N. Which one?
Ask the question again, please.
Which VM family is ideal to use for multi-session hosts?
E.
E, yes, because they have more memory, right? These are what's known as memory optimized VMs. And oh, you're not seeing my screen anymore, huh? Are you guys seeing my screen?
I see it. Yep.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it looks like it's a web browser.
Yeah. So you got
DSV2 series on it.
Yeah. So you got the E series machines, which are memory optimized machines. What that really means is that they give you double the amount of memory for about 15% more cost compared to your standard general machines. So you have your general purpose machines, which are your D series family of machines. And then the memory optimized ones give you double the amount of memory for only 15% more cost compared to the D series machine. And why is that important? It should be pretty obvious, but people open up Chrome and use up a million tabs, and they don't close it at night, and they open up multiple Excels and PowerPoints and Outlook, and all those things eat up RAM. So if you have multiple people on a single machine and you don't give it enough RAM, what happens to a Windows machine is this, right? And you probably never really paid attention to this, especially if you're dealing with like physical desktops. Is you give somebody like a 8 gig machine, and maybe they're using 7.7 gigs and but it magically never runs out of memory, right? You never really get a memory issue, right? Because the operating system is smart about it. It uses your page files. When you're running out of memory, it'll take memory that you haven't touched in a while, and it'll put them in like a text file that gets stored on a C drive somewhere. That's the page file. Now, when that happens on a computer, you don't really notice it, right? But when it happens on a multi-session environment, multi-session VDI environment, you'll feel it because, again, IOPS on a 128 gig C drive is only so much, right? And if you're constantly taking things that are in RAM, which is really, really fast memory, and you're now figuring out what to put on a page file because you're running low on memory, you're putting it on a page file that a page file running on a disk that's really, really slow. Even though it's a premium SSD, it's way slower than what RAM can do. So the constant fetching and pulling and reading and writing to that page file is really, really slow. So if you don't have enough memory, and you'll notice that a VDI environment will never go above 50% memory usage. Like it's very rare to see like a Windows machine, a WVD machine use above 50% because it tries not to, right? When it gets near the 50% mark, it'll start writing to your page file. If your page file is running on a disk that's slow, you're going to get an overall sluggish experience, right? You'll click on a thing, it'll take a while to load up and it won't open. You know, all those things, you know, cause a user to kind of experience sluggish performance on the machine. So if you give it an E series machine, you basically have more memory than you'll ever need. It'll never or rarely need to use the page file, which will overall increase the size of your the performance of your machine. Especially if you use the tactic of reimaging a machine and deallocating and recreating it every day. Basically, the RAM gets wiped out every time that happens, and you're starting off your day with a brand new machine, basically with, you know, lots of memory being available for you. I'm not saying D machines are a bad idea. It's just you'll run across a situation where you run out of memory more often if you pick a D series machine. We have people using it without a problem, and they may not be opening up a million tabs, or they may not be using a lot of apps, right? But if you're not sure, just err on the side of caution and just give them the quote the E series machine, so you don't ever run into that issue. Okay, so that's also something that obviously not as common as the IOPS issue, but something else that we see you know, pretty often as well. Usually when you switch to E series machine, the problem immediately goes away. And another way you could tell if you're experiencing something like that is if an engineer comes to you and says, every time I reboot a machine, the problem is gone. And then after a couple of days, it's slow again and I have to reboot it again, right? That tells you that the page file is growing. It's being written and read to a thing that's too slow. And when you reboot a machine, the page file goes away, RAM clears out, and you start off with a clean slate. So those are clues that you can listen to help you determine what type of issue it really is. Okay. And there's something called an ephemeral OS disk. Let me show you what an ephemeral OS disk is. An ephemeral OS disk. So remember I told you how a managed disk works inside of an Azure data center, where it's really just a carved out version of a SAN, and it's attached by a SCSI. So there's something in Azure called an ephemeral OS disk. And so you got parts of the data center where your compute is, and then parts of the data center where your storage is, right? But inside of each compute node, inside of each like D8 or E8 VM, there's NVMe cache that's local to the hardware node itself, right? It's generally used for like temp files and just cache that if you're not using it doesn't get used. But in machines that are 8 cores and above, there's enough NVMe cache to store a typical C drive, like a Windows operating system. So instead of using a managed disk that's attached over iSCSI, you can actually use that local cache drive that's local to the machine that has 8 cores and above, and use that. And because that drive is local to the machine, there's no latency going over iSCSI to read and write to a C drive. And when you're doing that, you can get huge improvements from an IOP perspective that you can never get, even if you set up a premium SSD. So these are some benchmarking charts. And the great thing about ephemeral OS disks is that they're free to use. They're even cheaper than premium SSDs, but they're only available if you select a VM that's 8 cores and above. Because VMs that are under 8 cores, they all have NVMe cache, but the NVMe cache is not large enough to store a typical C drive.
What is that storage value? Is it 128? Is it 50, 80?
Yeah, it's every single VM is different. So if you want to know what that storage value is, you go to the Azure calculator and you go to virtual machines. But the general rule of thumb is anything 8 cores and above has enough to store a typical C drive. So you see like this VM, for example, D13V2, it's got a 400 gig temp storage. Every VM has some kind of temp storage, except now in the generation 4 VMs, there are some VMs that don't have temp storage.
That temp storage value is the value we're looking for. Cool.
Yeah, well, yes and no. So temp storage is typically any VM that you spin up in Azure has got a D drive. That D drive says temporary storage, and inside of every D drive, you have a notepad that says, and it comes in every language. It says, do not put stuff in here that if you're not afraid to lose it, right? So basically, anything you use the D drive for, when you deallocate a machine, you can guarantee it's gone. But there's another NVMe storage that we're using for the environmental OS disk that isn't listed here, but I'm pretty sure that the sizes are pretty typical. So if I go to D8 ASV4, yeah, so this one has a 64 gig temp storage, but I know the NVMe disk is larger than that because I could fit a 128 gig SSD in there. So
Gotcha.
to
So
answer
at
your question,
minimum,
Danny, it's not
128
exact.
gig.
Yeah.
At minimum, are we saying 8 cores and minimum we have 128 gigs each time we pick an 8 core?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Any core machine has enough cache to use in a firmware OS disk, right? And now some people have even gotten smarter about it because, like, let's say you go with a 4-core machine, but a typical image for a Windows 10 is probably around 70 gigs or something, I think. I don't know what it is now. But some people have even been able to shrink that size to make it fit a 4-core machine to really get the optimization out of it. So why is this important? It's because at the end of the day, it's going to be much faster. And you can see the charts how much faster it is sometimes. But also it's free. So I was working with a customer that came to us that already deployed WVD, that had about 200 and something session hosts, and they were spending about $3,000 or $4,000 in just disks alone, right? Just renting out a premium disk every time. And a premium disk is about $18 a month, right? When you reserve it, when you have it in use. So out of all those machines, he had thousands of dollars worth of disks. And when we put in Nerdio and we flipped over to just using ephemeral OS disks, his performance hugely increased, and he was able to save a couple $1,000s just on disk alone by not having those machines.
What's kind of the user count we're upgrading to a host machine that can do the ephemeral?
Yeah, about 8 power users.
Okay.
Yeah, 8 power users or 10, normal users or 12 light users.
Okay.
But yeah, so when I quote, I always like to quote 1 user per CPU core, and that I'm doing that to protect myself because if I'm getting incorrect data, because let's say you're going into an environment that you're not familiar with, all right? Maybe you just won an MSP customer and they're right fit for WVD. The first thing you're going to ask them is probably, what are you running on your desktop computers, right? And they'll give you a list, but having done this enough times, I know the customer lies, right? Maybe they're not lying, they just don't know. So when you're onboarding, right, you might have said, all right, I got all these applications installed, everything looks good, and then somebody out of the blue says, oh, by the way, I use this application and this one. Well, why didn't you tell us? Oh, we didn't know, right? So because of that, I like to quote things using 1 person per vCPU core, just to make sure I'm safe, right? Because if somebody else makes a mistake or I don't catch something I'm supposed to, I don't have to ask my customer for more money because that mistake was mine, right? So when I pick an 8-core machine, I always pick power user as the type of user. That way, Nerdio calculator helps me overestimate what I truly need. And if you find out after a week that, hey, they're really just professional workers, maybe I can eliminate a host and save money, right? Maybe I could pass it on to the customer, or maybe I could just pocket it myself, right?
I'm guessing you have to make the decision of the ephemeral up front, because I'm guessing once you resize, you can't convert an actual OS disk to the other.
You can
Okay.
because of the fact that we're using the golden image concept, right? Golden images are just a VM that's off most of the time.
Oh, you just have to rebuild it.
Yeah,
right?
you have to reimage it, right?
Okay.
Reimage it, and those hosts that were using your standard premium disks are going to be reimaged to using a environmental OS disk. Now, it's not all sunshines and rainbows here. It's just that there are a drawback. The drawback is that you can't have machines on standby like this. So remember yesterday or 2 days ago, we talked about that auto scale policy, how I had 2 machines on standby and 1 active at all times, right? So in that example I just showed you, you had 3 machines that were spun up, but only 1 of them are active and 2 of them are on standby. You cannot have any standby machines when you're using ephemeral OS disks because, well, a machine has to be on for that NVMe cache to be able to be used. So you can't have a machine like sitting idle like this, right? The benefit of having a machine sitting idle like this is if I need to grow really fast, it takes less than a minute for this machine to become active, right? If I'm using an ephemeral OS disk, I can't have things on standby. So if I need a new machine, it'll take probably about 10 minutes for that machine to build. So in that case, if you're using EOSD, because it's got all these other benefits, you may want to, right, set your auto scale policy. So when I hit, maybe normally I would pick like when I grow up to 8 users, spin up another machine. Maybe I want to lower that number to 6, right? So when it hits 6 people, I can anticipate getting a new machine spun up for the 2 other people who are going to join later. Or I'm using ephemeral OS disks and I just pre-stage the machines. So I know Monday through Friday, I know I'm gonna have 5 machines on. So by 8 a.m. So I'm gonna spin up all 5 machines. They're all gonna use ephemeral OS disks, and then let auto scaling scale them back in and move them back down to 1. So there's multiple methods you can use to kind of so this looks kind of not flexible, but it's actually very, very flexible. So you can give them, the whole goal of this is to give them exactly what they want at the time they want it, and when they scale back in or when they log off, you remove your cost by reducing machines. So that's another sort of performance type of related topic, I guess. From a RMM standpoint, Nerdio has made it so you can actually shadow users. I don't know if there's anybody logged in, but if I had somebody logged in, you can actually shadow somebody using the Nerdio tool now. You don't have to use your own RMM tool. So a lot of people used to complain about, well, if these machines are spinning up and spinning down, if I'm installing my antivirus or my RMM stuff in there, I'm going to be left with a lot of rogue agents that will never check in again because that machine will never come back up again, right? As the same name, maybe, right? So a lot of people are just opting in not to put these things in because you can guarantee by the end of the night the machine is gone. Now, if you're not using that approach of re-imaging a machine every single day, yeah, you might still want to install your RMM and your antivirus tools on there because those machines are pretty much static and you're the one that controls when they get re-imaged. So again, there's options to deal with that. Any questions about any of this? Performance, troubleshooting related topics or tasks?
Thank you.
Nope. Okay. Let's see. Does everybody know how to get somebody to log into WVD? So we talked about sort of to spin up the management of it. Let's talk about sort of the end user customer experience. So if you're a Windows user or a Mac user or an iOS, Android, iPad, whatever, there's a WVD client for that type of device. And I'll just talk about the Windows one for now. For the Windows one, you'll download the WVD client from just Google. You can just Google search WVD client. And the first non-advertisement website that comes up is the Microsoft documentation that gives you access to the 64-bit, the 32-bit, the Surface ARM client. You have the web client, you have the Android client, the Mac OS, iOS, the Microsoft Store client, the Thing clients. Like they all have entry points into WVD. So when you get into WVD, you just download the client, install it. It looks like this. You open it up, and I have a demo environment, so I got a bunch of crap in it. But the first thing you're gonna do is hit the subscribe button. When you hit subscribe, the typical Microsoft login box comes up, and you type in your customer's email address and password, the same Office 365 email address and password. So once you get into it, you'll see what you guys have published for the customer. So you can give somebody a remote app that looks just like this, or somebody the full desktop, right? So if I log into like a full desktop, I can then see everything that my customers that you've installed in the customer's environment, right? You can load their QuickBooks or their pension application, whatever the case may be. You have, the fact that it's multi-session here. But from here, everything else pretty much works just like a normal computer would. Most devices will redirect, printing, scanning. Now, scanning is a topic maybe I want to spend some time in. Scanning, if you're doing scan to network or scan to email, obviously that has nothing to do with WVD and that'll all work. If you're doing like a scan to Twain application or like let's say you have an EMR and it has like the ability to scan a patient's ID card, an insurance card when they're checking into the office, you're probably using like a Fujitsu ScanSnap or one of those type of high-speed scanners. Those require a special tool called TSCAN that allows the scanner to directly talk to the application. So there's a piece of software you have to buy if that was your use case. But everything else should work just fine.
So TIA is TIA?
Oh no, it's TSCAN. It stands for Terminal Server or Terminal. Here, it's this product right here.
Scan. There we go.
Yeah, yeah, and they sell it per user or per session host. So it's a license by a session host. I would buy the session host method. But there's a this license is actually licensed by the computer ID or the machine ID. The problem we've had with them is that whenever a machine reimages, it gets a new computer ID and the product deactivates. So if you're buying this from them, you have to tell them that Nerdio sent you to buy them, and there's a special version of the software they've made for Nerdio customers that makes it so it doesn't matter how many times you reimage a machine, the software will never deactivate. I've had that problem where people complain about that problem.
And that's the same thing with the auto scaling, right? I would imagine, because
yeah, the auto scaling or the scale and scale out. Yeah.
Okay.
So pay attention to software that gets activated by the computer machine if you're installing that piece of software on the session host. If the company is aware of VDI technology in general, they have a solution for it, and obviously these guys do, because this is all they do is provide scanning sort of a support for RDS and WVD environments, Citrix environments, but not all software know that that's the use case. So there's that. Let's see, anything else from a troubleshooting perspective? So sometimes you're also, like let's say there's a scenario where there's a patch that comes out, like QuickBooks, 2021 R18 comes out, and everybody's on the older version of QuickBooks, and your goal is to kind of re-image or replace their desktops with the new version of the QuickBooks, right? So in an RDS environment, you would probably go into each RDS host and individually update them, right? And because you don't have the concept of re-imaging, and those machines are pretty static, and you have to kind of update something multiple times. But in Nerdio, you basically go to the image, update the image here, because the image is completely separate from the session hosts that are running. And then when you're ready, if you had that automatic task set up where every night at 3 a.m. it automatically re-images, then you don't really have to do anything but wait till the next morning. But if it was an urgent patch or something that you're trying to get out really quick, you go to the pool, you go to manage host, and you see that there's one machine that's currently online, and let's say there were 5 users in it, and these 2 other machines have nobody in it because they're not even turned on. But what happens is this machine is, whatever's in these 3 machines are old from the old image prior to the R18 update, right? So you can actually see when the image, when this machine was provisioned and what template it was using. So let's say you just updated the template and you need to get something out in an emergency. You can pretty much add 3 other hosts. Let's just add 3. I'm gonna just call these test machines for now. Let's say I add 3 machines to the pool. So when this is done, I'm gonna have a total of 6 machines, right? So right now it's just adding 3 hosts right now, but all the users are spread, let's say, amongst these 3 machines. What you wanna do is go to deactivate them, right? If I deactivate all 3 machines, what that does is actually tells Microsoft not to let anybody new into the hosts, right? So no new users are gonna be able to log into the old machines, and they're automatically gonna get diverted into the new machines. And you can send a message out, like you can see the send message button. Right now it's not enabled because there's nobody in the machine. But you can say, hey, we just updated your newest QuickBooks. At your convenience, please log off and log back in. So when they log off the session host and they log back in, because they're already in a deactivated state, Microsoft's not going to let them back into the old machines, and they're just going to get diverted to the new machines that have the new image with the new updated software. So once this count goes to 0, you can pretty much go and delete the machines. Right? If you go delete the machines, Nerdio will take care of automatically, gracefully, destroy it and remove it from your domain and do everything in a very clean manner, and to make sure that all that squared away. So that's sort of the process of doing in-place replacement in a live environment when you're managing a VDI environment, right? So it's certainly interesting because we don't do that now with on-premise infrastructure. If you need to update something, if you're lucky enough to script it, you can push it out using RMM. But other than that, you have to go visit every single computer and install whatever update they have, right? So that's how large enterprises are able to manage tens of thousands of computers with just a handful of IT people, because they do it in a very methodological type of manner.
Leverages the technology.
Yeah, and guys like Citrix and Horizon, they've had this for a long time. So that's why a lot of large organizations, they don't just do RDS native. They use something like Citrix or Horizon, because those guys have built in functionality that does all this. So maybe I'll just cancel these. I don't want to actually spin them up. But actually, before I cancel them, you can go to details and you can see what Nerdio's done already. So we're now in the process of creating the VMs to make them available. We're going to join them to the domain, and then you're ready to use them, basically. Any questions about how to manage or troubleshoot or just general anything?
I know I've struggled in the past a lot with remote printing, and everybody likes to buy their own printer, and they don't all necessarily work with the Windows remote print and stuff like that. Do you have a good way to kind of combat that?
Yeah, so WVD's remote print is much better than RES's remote print. I haven't had anybody with really any issues with remote print, but there are still software out there, like the same company that does TSScan, does TS Print. Terminalworks.com, and then you have ThinPrint, and you have all these like different VDI print vendors that make printing much easier. But I would say the WVD client is pretty much good enough. Like those other guys, what they do is they compress the print job and then they push it over to the end client, and then they decompress. So that's what they do. I don't think WVD does that just yet, but unless you're printing like 150 meg documents, I wouldn't really go with a separate tool. If you're just printing regular Word documents, the regular built-in WVD client, it works just fine.
So if you're doing like AutoCAD
CAD
plot
printing,
jobs or something like
right?
CAD printing, yeah, okay, all right.
Yeah, so that's when ThinPrint and things like that make sense, because if I can take a 150 meg file and shrink it down to maybe 20 megs and then have it decompress on the other side, that just makes the waiting time for a large print job much shorter. But for your normal office environment, not something you need to worry about. But on the scanning side, you do, because scanning with a Twain thing, that natively doesn't really work too well, which is why I recommend somebody like this that does it. These guys do all sorts of terminal server technology type of redirecting solutions. But more and more of this stuff is being handled natively by Microsoft now. So like TS Webcam, I don't see anybody ever needing to do that anymore. But things like scan in between, probably still so.
Hey, Tony, we're about out of time here.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, if you guys don't have any other questions, thank you. And I think the next class, and just a reminder, if you guys haven't signed up for the free Nerdio 6-month thing, let me actually just put the link here. We have a 6-month offer where if you're deploying a new customer between now and June, Microsoft's paying Nerdio for the licensing. So make sure you know what, I'll send everything to Lane. Sorry, Lane, I'm gonna have you as the person that communicates this stuff. But okay, anything else, guys?
Thanks, Tony.
Thank you.
Okay, hopefully this stuff was helpful. I don't know.
Yeah, thanks, Tony. That was great.
Okay, all right, appreciate it, guys.
Thanks,
everyone.
Tony.
Okay, bye-bye.